over the Gaza war. And shortly after that war, just like we've seen on several occasions recently, we started to hear these calls for boycott. And we're in a situation, of course, where the world is in fairly grave financial situation, and Israel hasn't been doing too bad, but we felt it a little bit. And oh, me of little faith, when I started hearing about these calls for boycott, I'm thinking, oh Lord, we don't need a boycott. We want to keep our economy going. We don't want to lose our exports and our national income. But in the same week that they were calling for these boycotts, a oil exploration company they announced the discovery of what they said then was one of the largest fields of natural gas anywhere in the world, 50 miles off the coast of Haifa. But they were wrong. A few months later they announced that it was even bigger. And then they were wrong again, and a few months after that they announced, hey, it's even bigger again. And just one more item, a few weeks ago now, they made this announcement that indeed it is the largest field of natural gas and some oil, but the largest field of natural gas ever discovered anywhere in the world. And there's about 1.7 billion barrels of oil down there. And apparently there's 166 trillion, and I don't even know what a trillion is, but there's 166 trillion cubic feet of natural gas out there. So the Europeans and whoever else, they can boycott Israel as much as they like. I'll eat all of the oranges and the watermelons, thank you very much. Well, not all of it. And they'll have to stand in front of God and account for why they opposed everything he was doing, to oppose the Jewish people's right to live in the land that God has promised them is to oppose God himself. What they don't seem to realize, and I have to ask the question, what Bible do they read? And really, I'm basically an evangelist, and I have a deep concern for their eternal salvation, because the way I see it, where you stand with Israel ultimately, after your relationship with the Father through the blood of Yeshua, but where one stands and one's attitude towards Israel and the Jewish people, I would say that after our relationship with the Father, it is the factor that determines where we're going to spend eternity. Yes. And even I have to ask the question, what God are they worshipping? Because the God I believe in, he said that before the sun or the moon ever ceased from giving their light, will Israel ever cease from being a nation before him? He poses the question very clearly through Paul in Romans chapter 11, verse 1. I say then, has God finished with Israel? And some Bibles say certainly not. Other Bibles say God forbid. Other versions say may it never be. And yet there's a large portion of the church who believes that God is finished with Israel. Well, their God might have, but mine hasn't. And ours hasn't. Amen. And they seem to have forgotten the fact that Israel, I believe that Israel, more specifically even Jerusalem, and even more specifically, if you want to get really focused down, the Temple Mount, I believe that's God's address on the earth. And if you want to put it a little bit more simply, it's like, Yeshua is coming back very soon, flying through the air, right? Yeah. And so, the Lord's coming back flying like an aeroplane, and Israel's the airport. No, seriously. Yeah. And what happens if you take the airport away? It's like the aeroplane's going to fly around for a little while and go back to where it came from. But they seem to have lost sight of this. And as I said, what Bible do they read? And I guess they would call themselves believers. Well, what do believers do? Or what are believers supposed to do? We're supposed to believe, right? But some of these people, they believe very little. There's large portions of the so-called church who they don't believe in the virgin birth. They don't believe in the physical resurrection. They don't believe in a physical second coming of Messiah. So you have to ask the question, actually, what do they believe? Very little, unfortunately. So that's the situation we find ourselves in today. Israel is in her most perilous, precarious, dangerous time of her entire existence. And much of the church is silent or even speaking against and working against what God is doing. So let's take a look now at the situation on the ground. We've got Hezbollah up on the northern border, and 2006, that was 4 years ago now, we had that second Lebanon war. And prior to that war, apparently Hezbollah had about 12,000 rockets and missiles basically aiming at my house. well, not my house, but the whole of northern Israel in general. But we live on top of Mount Carmel. It's only 30 kilometers, 20 miles to the northern border. And we had 4,000 of those missiles come into the general area where we live in 2006. Now, that war was brought to an end by UN Resolution 1701, which called for Hezbollah to disarm. Not only has Hezbollah not disarmed, Hezbollah has rearmed right under the nostrils of the United Nations. And today, they say that Hezbollah has somewhere between 50 to 80,000 missiles and rockets. They're newer models, so they fly further, they fly faster, they carry a greater payload, and they have chemical and biological warheads. And just before we came away, we were given our new generation gas masks, which make some people feel good, but if you understand anything about that kind of warfare, unless you have a complete closed suit on, it's not going to do you any good, but it makes people feel a little bit more secure anyway. So we've got that situation on the northern border. They're also digging tunnels, according to the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. They're digging tunnels underneath the border, and they've also established terror cells in many of the Arab villages in the Galilee. Now, in the Galilee, the Arab people that live out there are no checkpoints, there are no barriers. They just are free to travel and come and go because they're not Palestinian Arabs, they're Israeli Arabs. But in the midst of all those Arab villages, there are terror cells, and apparently the plan is once this war begins, they'll fire their rockets and missiles on the surface, from the surface, but at the same time, Hezbollah operatives will come through the tunnels and they'll come out of these villages and they're going to infiltrate the towns and the cities of northern Israel, and I guess cause as much trouble there as they can. So that's the northern border. Down on the southern border, the Gaza Strip, the tunnels that Israel destroyed in the Gaza war last year, most of them have been re-established, and there's been all sorts of weaponry coming in, plus Al-Qaeda personnel. And Hezbollah are also sponsoring, or it's Iran that's behind it, but Hezbollah, Hamas, they're all working together, and I believe that they are preparing for a united attack against Israel. Let's go a little bit further over towards Iran, and I think we all know what he's up to over there. Our friend Mr. Ahmadinejad, he obviously is still every now and then publicly calling for the destruction of Israel. I mean, nobody says anything, or virtually nobody says anything. Imagine if an Israeli leader stood up and said, we need to destroy Egypt or Jordan or whatever. I mean, the world would come down on Israel like a ton of bricks, but nobody's saying a word. And at the same time, Iran is racing towards capability of producing nuclear weapons. And a few weeks ago, Mr. Ahmadinejad said if anybody touches Iran, he's going to set the Straits of Hormuz on fire. Now, the Straits of Hormuz is the sea area above Iran, and it's where 40% of the world's oil passes through the Straits of Hormuz. At the same time, we've got America, we've got the entire Fifth Fleet, which comprises of a number of aircraft carriers and their warships. There's part of the Sixth Fleet has gone in there. Apparently a US nuclear missile submarine is in there, and even Israel has sent a submarine in there. And I believe, don't tell anybody David Silver said this because you'll get me into trouble, but I believe that submarine is also nuclear armed. On the other hand, Russia is supplying $50 billion of modern military equipment to Syria, and that again will get into the hands of Hezbollah, and it'll probably filter down to Hamas as well. So that's the situation on the ground. Even just in the last few days, there's reports coming through that Hezbollah are now placing their missiles all the way along the northern border with Israel. They're putting them in hospitals, they're putting them in schools, because these guys know that once they start firing out of those sort of places, Israel has to think twice about firing back, because Israel cares about what the world thinks. Maybe I think, in fact, we care too much about what the world thinks. The Israeli army obviously is aware of all these things, so the IDF is also moving towards the northern border. So you know, this whole thing is starting to boil up. And even before this happened, I was in, or even before the Gaza flotilla happened, I was just starting off a tour of the USA. And what I was saying at that time, it's like someone has packed the gunpowder into the bomb, they've put the fuse in, and someone's standing there with a match, just waiting for some crazy guy to come along and light that fuse. And I think the situation that I've just described, I think we can see that that really is the case. The whole Middle East is ready to go up in flames. It's just going to take something. It could have happened today with this Libyan ship. That could have developed. So far, it hasn't developed into that. Apparently, the Israeli Navy just put all their ships across its path and diverted it down to Egypt. But I mean, those people are intent on getting through to the Gaza Strip. So I don't think that incident is quite over yet. But it could have happened today. It could happen next week. It may be a matter of weeks or months. It might not happen this summer, but a large number of military experts, even from the United States, are saying that they are expecting a major war in the Middle East this summer. And last week, Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, he actually was in a meeting with a large number of other Arab leaders, and he was suggesting a major Arab attack on Israel. So we can see that the Middle East is ready to go up in flames. And when the Middle East goes up, the Western world is going to come down. Because I'm sure you'll agree with me, the entire Western world's economy is just hanging on by a thread. And it won't take very much to cut that thread. And we're all going to be in very, very serious trouble. And you know, we all like to think that life is linear. We like to think that tomorrow is going to be just the same or fairly similar to the way it was today. And praise God, for most of us, it generally is. But you know, on 9/11, 3,000 people went to New York, into work in New York, into the Twin Towers, thinking, ho-hum, just another Monday. They may or may not have kissed their wives and kids goodbye, thinking they were going to be home again that night. But 3,000 people didn't arrive home that night. And really, none of us have any kind of solid guarantee that tomorrow is going to be just the same as it was today. I mean, hopefully it will be, of course. But really, I kind of changed my titles a little bit depending upon who I'm speaking to. And really, the title of the notes I'm using is actually "Failing to Prepare is Preparation to Fail." And I was I just arrived in Ottawa, I think it was, in the middle of this US and Canada tour I did about a month or so ago. And I don't usually really get words from the Lord or clear words from the Lord in a meeting, because I'm kind of thinking about what I'm going to be doing. But as the worship was taking place, I clearly heard the Lord giving two words: get ready. And I think as much as that was a word for Canada at the time, I believe that's a word for everybody. All around the world right now, get ready. Anything, literally anything can happen in this world at any time. And of course, living in Israel, and I don't think lots of people think, gee, how can you guys live there under that kind of pressure? Well, the advantageous thing about living in Israel is we are far more ready for whatever the enemy can throw at us. We are ready. Not as ready as what we should be, of course, but even as I saw this starting to boil up, we got our gas masks, so I restocked our makhzan. What's a makhzan in English? Our storehouse downstairs with a bunch of water. We didn't do it, but I should have. We were going to go out and buy a big stock of canned food and Cadbury's chocolate bars to keep us going, just at least for a few days. But when something breaks loose, we've got our medical kits, we've got some flashlights, hopefully with our batteries charged up, and a battery-powered radio. There's all sorts of things we can do to try at least to be ready in some way, shape, or form. And I got this title from another guy who was ministering some time back, and his ministry was like a Joseph story. It wasn't Barry Siegel, but this guy also had a Joseph-type ministry. And he was basically saying that the Lord had told him to prepare a storehouse in the years of plenty in preparation for the years of famine. And he just said this, he just gave us this one-liner. He just said, failing to prepare